right, I think we're ready. Good morning. It's
Morning.
always hard when
Morning.
you move to YouTube because there's that moment when it goes on, but you don't realize it. Welcome, everyone, to our Wednesday study session that after 8.5 years, we've still not given a name to. And it's always a pleasure to have everybody here. It's our class where we decide what we're studying a week in advance, or maybe sometimes several weeks in advance. We'll talk at the end of this session about how we want to go afterwards, because Larry and a few others have given some great ideas. Today, we're going to just talk a little bit about Jewish musicians in the 20th century, staying away from some of the ones, Larry, you've mentioned that other people may talk about. We're going to have Jeff, who's going to come on at some point and talk with us about some really much more intricately and detailed into some of the music stuff. But I thought we'd start off a little bit by just talking about some of the big names, like who in the 20th century really who changed music, would be considered at the top of their class in whatever area, were influential. So, which makes it really quite difficult, as we know, because if you look at, if you do a Wikipedia list of Jews in music in the 20th century and 19th century, it's a lot of people. There's like more than 7. It's really a lot. That was a joke. The list is like beyond. Yeah, thank you, Harriet. So we'll look a little bit just about how it all came about, and then maybe look over a few of the people. And then I know later we're going to have some experts come in and talk a little bit more about it. And Larry will talk a little bit more about that as we get it all set up. So first of all, have Jews always been big in music? The answer is obviously yes and no. It's always dependent upon what they've been allowed to do. As we know, Jewish music has been part of our culture since the biblical times. We have the Psalms, which were probably songs. We have references to musical instruments throughout, even instruments that I know what the lyre is an instrument. I still don't know what it is, but I think you spell it Lyre. It's mentioned a lot in Psalms. And so we have had music for a long time. But as with anything else, in the outside world, we were only allowed, when Jews were prominent in music was generally when the outside world was very open. So the more open the outside world was, the more open we were and the more options we had. Obviously, during the golden age of Spain, we had a lot of musicians, especially a lot of poets, a lot of writers. But as we know, as the last millennium went into full gear, Jews were restricted. So the Jewish music became solely Jewish music for a very long time. But of course, by the 19th century, starting in the 18th century, we started to be invited into the rest of the world. And of course, it's going to be a whole different animal in the 20th century. So you saw some Jews really able to make headway in the outside world. And obviously, the two most famous would be Mahler and Mendelssohn, who are, the two of the great 19th century musicians. And so we also have to understand, in order for them to be able to become these great composers, what did they have to do? They had to convert. So both Mendelssohn and Mahler converted. I think one to Catholicism, the other to be a Protestant. And so that's how they became part of the musical world, by converting. So obviously their talent, and even after they converted, especially with Mahler, obviously he's in Germany, and then later during the 30s and 40s, his music, the 1930s and 40s, his music was, not allowed to be played. And then he had a big comeback after the World War II. But certainly he was still restricted in some ways, and Mendelssohn obviously comes from one of the most famous Jewish families of all time. So him converting, the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn converting, must have been a big deal and a big shock. There's still Jews today who will not play his music, especially at weddings, because he did convert. But obviously they both converted most likely because they wanted to be part of the music world. The 20th century, though, changed the whole game. I mean, the game changed incredibly in the 20th century, as we all know. What we're going to see is, whereas Jews were once in a while allowed to become into the club, in the 20th century, we are going to be the executive committee of the club. Whereas in the 19th, 20th century, we converted or we had to play down our Judaism. In the 20th century, no such issue whatsoever. I give the example, even, you guys have heard of the country of India, right? India is a country. India is a predominantly Hindu country. I think like 700 million to 800 million out of the 1.1 to 1.5 million, whatever. It's a majority Hindu. Minority of Muslim, but there are a lot of Muslims. There's like 300 million Muslims. There's a lot of prejudice against Muslims in India. They're not always considered first-class citizens. However, when it comes to movie stars, a very high percentage of movie stars in India are Muslim. And the Hindus, many of who do not like Muslims, don't care when it comes to movie stars. I don't like, and you can say the same in America. I am a prejudiced guy. I do not like African Americans. Who's your favorite musician? Oh, my favorite musician is, and then name any one of the great Michael Jackson or Prince. I don't like, so again, there's this sentiment that if you're in the entertainment industry, maybe you'll get a pass that really has taken the 20th century. And in the 20th century, as we know, not as much as in comedy or movies or TV, but a very high percentage of the great musicians of the 20th century have been Jewish, a very great percentage. There has been very little restriction, especially when it comes to composing music, almost none comparatively. There's been a little bit for like, 40s and 50s singers, but very little. I mean, we would think, when you think of any era, almost the first person you will think of is probably Jewish in many respects. And so we'll look at some of those. When we think of the big band era, you think of who?
Goodman.
Benny Goodman. I mean, I don't even know anybody else. I mean, I know two band people from that age, and they're both Jewish. And I didn't know, well, if you include Lawrence Welk, 3, but I didn't learn Benny Goodman's name because he's Jewish. He's like the only one I know. I'm not from that era. If you think earlier, you think of ragtime, who are we thinking about? We're thinking about 2 people. You think of Irving Berlin and George Gershwin those are the 2 top people in terms of composers in the beginning of the 20th century. And obviously they're both Jewish. So, and you can go through the list and there's just so many that it's impossible to talk about all of them unless you have a lot of time, which we don't have that much time to talk about all of them. But the number of them is just incredible. So we're going to talk about a few, and we're going to talk about what led them to be in this field and be so dominant. And remember, when they started in the early 20th century, there were still a lot of restrictions on Jews in many fields. The fields that were already, yes, Stuart.
Yeah, I don't totally agree with your premise. I certainly agree with the premise relative to popular music, so-called popular music. But when it comes to serious or classical music, even as late as the 40s and probably after that, there was a big push for Leonard Bernstein to change his name to Leonard S. Burns to get away from it. So classical music did not have the same openness that perhaps ended up in popular music.
And that's an excellent point. And but still, even so, the 20th century allowed Jewish musicians to stay Jewish. Whereas the 19th century, you were not. So again, still took a longer time. And obviously Gershwin and Berlin and all these people faced anti-Semitism at different levels, but not to the point of Mendelssohn and Mahler. And of course, if you go back 100 years, they just weren't allowed to be musicians at all in the outside world. So you're right. I mean, we have to, even today in the classical world, which I am not as much familiar, there still may be some semblance of that since it's very popular in Europe. But when we look at 20th century popular music, and that's a good distinction, we're going to see it. I don't know if it starts, but we all know where it comes from. It comes from, obviously, the Yiddish world, as the Yiddish culture really boomed in the 19th century in Russia and Poland. We had this incredible conclave of artists in every area, from literature to comedy, obviously, to music. And of course, what music really became popular in the Jewish world was, of course, we all know klezmer, which means basically vessel of song, and that originates in the Pale settlement, but it went as far as the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. So this idea of this happy, excitable music, which probably has it's part of the modern, what we call the Haskalah. It's like the modern Jewish Renaissance of the 19th century, where you saw Hasidim become very fervent in their belief in the way they pray in the 17th century. And then in the 18th and 19th century, as Europe opened up, the Jewish world got tastes of that as well. And we had our own opening in the Jewish world. And that's where this Yiddish music comes from, this idea that we're getting to be more part of the culture, that we're celebrating a little bit more, that we are very educated, which obviously is going to be the main reason that Jews do so well in this area, because we're all educated. And again, as with anything else, reading music is a lot easier if you're literate than if you're not. And it's also easier to be a famous, really top-notch musician if your parents are educated and if you've had experiences with classical music and this kind of music. So this is where we come in with these people. They are either people born in Eastern Europe and moved to America, or whose parents did the same. And it all has to do, everything has to do with the year 1881. The Tsar is assassinated, anti-Semitism is at an all-time high in Russia, and all of these Jews and this whole Yiddishkeit movement comes to America, where there's even more freedoms. And if there's more freedoms, obviously there's more opportunity, and music was an area where there's a lot of opportunity, except maybe in classical, because, that obviously, think about people like Shakespeare and Mozart. They were very popular with the masses, and then it kind of drizzled up in many ways to the hierarchy. In America, this idea of popular music that we know today is not really taken hold of people yet. And it's really going to come in the 20th century with a lot of these first and second generation Jews who understood this idea of klezmer music and then adapted it to the modern world. So when we see the greats, and we'll start with one or two of them, this is what happened. So let's start off with first Irving Berlin, who is the first big one. I mean, he is the man who sets the first domino down. And when Gershwin talks about why did he become so famous, and Ira Gershwin, it's because of Irving Berlin. Now, I am not as familiar with the music because it's not the music I grew up with. So I had, it's more something I know about him, but the idea that Jews in America were now able, in all the arts, to take what they saw the population wanted and then give it to them. That's what they did in movies and TV and comedy. They found out what the population kind of wanted, how they were made up of different cultures. They used their own cultural history and they put it all together and created what we would call the outsider music. And that's always how this top music has been started. Rock and roll did not start as the most popular music in the world. It started out as the young kids' music that parents wouldn't let them listen to, so they're listening to in the basement. The same thing with ragtime. this was not the upper classes. This is not what you wanted your kids if you were a very, affluent family. This was the kids who were rebelling and the young people who wanted to do something different. And so they get outsider music from outsiders. Now, Irving Berlin was born Israel Berlin, and he was actually born in Russia, but he moved here as a little boy and was raised in, obviously, New York. He's considered by many to be the first major Jewish songwriter to influence America. Again, having all of this spiritual connection. So his first song was published in 1907. So really at the very beginning of the 20th century, this is going to change. And it became a hit right away. I mean, his very first song that he published became a very big hit, but then the next great hit, probably one of the greatest hits of the 20th century of any song was, of course, anybody remember it? Because I don't think
Alexander's Ragtime Band.
That's right, Alexander's Ragtime Band. I was kidding, none of us remember it. It was 1911. That started all. I mean, we can probably say rock and roll comes directly from this one song. It started a dance crave, not only here, but back in Russia as well. I mean, that was the song that probably put modern music on the map and really brought it to the masses. And he wrote it. And so obviously he became the guy for writing what they would call music and lyrics for the vernacular, very similar to what Shakespeare did and what Mozart did. Now, Berlin, unlike George Gershwin, lived a long life. I mean, I think he was 100 when he died. Gershwin died in his mid-30s. Although who knows what would have happened if George Gershwin had lived another 60 years, and he might be considered the greatest all time, but otherwise he's up there. So Berlin wrote about 1,500 songs, 1,500, 19 Broadway shows and 18 Hollywood films he wrote for. We know that all of these famous people, so he was, again, this is a man who spoke, as they say, the people's English, even though he was not from America originally. So a lot of these immigrants were able to help create American culture in very odd and strange ways. And this is one of them. Almost every type of person loved this kind of music, from the Italians to the Irish to the Americans, people like romantic music. I mean, everyone seemed to like it. We also know a lot of this sound came from the African American community, which obviously we were not ready at that time to bring in overtly. But obviously that is a lot of it comes from another outsider community. But he's taken, whereas a Jew writing music was accepted by the masses, an African American was not quite ready yet, and if so, only in small doses, as opposed to Jews who could fit in a lot easier. And so after this song, it blows up. Obviously there's a World War, so things are going to pause. But after the World War I, all of a sudden we've got the Roaring '20s. We're at peace. The economy is fabulous. A lot of Americans have been overseas, unfortunately, under terrible circumstances, so we're a lot more worldly. The Jewish community on the East Coast is thriving in their bubble. There is some anti-Semitism, but it's nothing compared to what they left. So nobody really is that upset about it because it's much better here than any place else. And this is where this music and people like George Gershwin and Irving Berlin really take things to the next level. And it really sparks a whole wave. Now, Gershwin would be another one. Again, there's so many in between, but Gershwin would be probably number 2 in terms of the most influential of this part of this. And you guys, you might know. So Gershwin, of course, is born at the very end of the 19th century. And he is American. He's a first generation born here. And of course, he was trained classically, but also with Berlin and others, this guy could also morph into this cultural revolution of this idea of young people's music, of being free to dance in front of other people and not just at weddings. Men and women dancing together, not in the back rooms, but in the limelight, going all the way to everybody. I mean, that was a cultural shift. It would have been a lot of fun to be there, except for, they didn't have sushi, so I probably wouldn't have wanted to do it myself. And, they didn't take baths and have that kind of thing, and the food was probably really terrible. But the music was amazing, and of course, his most famous would be Rhapsody in Blue, which, like Alexander Ragtime Band, these two are probably more played than any other pieces from this part of the century, although both of them wrote tons of other things, obviously White Christmas and American in Paris, but those two are, the songs they're probably most known for. And so he helped pave the way for Jerome Kern and Betty Goodman and Bob Dylan, who are also obviously the next ones we'll talk about. Jerome Kern, of course, wrote Showboat and a lot of it. You had other ones at this time period, obviously Oscar Hammerstein and Ira Gershwin and E.Y. Harburg. So you had a lot of others all doing the same thing. They weren't overtly showing their Judaism. Like, not everybody listening knew Gershwin was Jewish, but they're not hiding it either. So, and they did write some music for Jewish, here and there, and they still wrote some klezmer music as well. So they didn't have to convert. Obviously when they're on their TV shows or radio shows or in concerts, they didn't brag about being Jewish, but it's really interesting that we assume everybody knew they were Jewish, but this is not necessarily the truth. I always give that example when I'm teaching in the mid 90s. I'm a fourth grade teacher at an elementary school in Houston area in a school district where I'm the only full-time Jewish employee or student in the whole district. There was one part-time speech therapist who was Jewish, and it's a very large district, and I'm the only Jew. This kindergarten woman and I were very good friends. We weren't dating, but we're friends. We'd always talk about our favorite show, which was Seinfeld. I think all of you've heard it. And after talking about it for a year or so, however, 2 years, one day I mentioned that, Seinfeld is my favorite Jewish comedian. And she said, of course, Seinfeld's not Jewish. And to me, it was so obvious. But if you look at the program itself, the first couple of years, they did not mention he was Jewish. They did no Jewish content for the first 2 or 3 years. Maybe even, so if you're not from New York, you don't realize what's going on. So for me, it was beyond obvious. I'm from McAllen, Texas. Even I, who was not in the New York Jewish world at all, it was so obvious that he was, how could you not think Jerry Seinfeld was Jewish? It's impossible. No, she had no idea. And nobody in that school knew he was Jewish either. So most likely people outside of the New York who did not know these guys were all Jewish. But obviously, as with, Muslim actors in India, even if they did, it was okay because it became part of the Plus, a lot of people like this outsider mentality, especially when you're young. You want to be against the grain. You want your parents to say, don't listen to that music, because it just encourages you to do something that you see to think is wrong, which means it's right. And so that is what's happening, and it really takes hold. And again, it's another one of these things, like Shakespeare, that starts from the bottom and goes up. Nowadays, Mozart and Shakespeare are considered like the greatest of all time, but during their time periods with the elite, especially in the beginning, they were not considered that necessarily. So, of course, Benny Goodman would be the most popular of the swing, big band era. I heard of him as a kid, and I didn't even know what big band was, and I heard of Benny Goodman. So he is obviously the most famous. There are other ones. He is, again, first generation American. He had 11 siblings, all poor Jewish, and he started playing professionally in a band, and he proved that what we all know to be true with people like Mick Jagger and Rick Ocasek, that if you're good at playing music, you can be super cool and get all the women, even if you're not particularly handsome or studly. I mean, he is like a very general looking, he's the guy who you think works in a cubicle in an accounting firm. I mean, he's a very normal looking kind of, not, you know, little, definitely Jewish, but kind of like not Shlemiel, but just like, you know, the kind of guy who sits and crunches numbers. And yet, of course, he becomes a huge star, and he creates another dance craze akin to what Berlin had done and what Gershwin had done, a little less so. So he helped start the next dance craze of the 30s and 40s. The jitterbug is one of them, as I think we all have heard of. I have not heard of a lot of these other ones, but the dancing starts coming back again after a time when, of course, the Depression hit, and probably had less and less of that. So it's really incredible that in each of these eras, the number one musician is Jewish. I mean, Berlin, Gershwin, and Goodman. I mean, it will not be the same in the next generation, but there will be a lot. But these three are definitely probably number one. Now, after this, of course, we're going to switch over to a whole different, and we're just doing generalities. We can go into specifics either today or later. And Tim maybe want to do this because Tim is a lot more familiar. But then we're going to go into a different type of music. So Benny Goodman obviously is going to stay popular for a very long time. You know, it's the site, you know, and a lot of people wonder, why did Jews do so well musically? Well, again, it's the same thing. We're educated. We're willing to look at things from a different perspective. We're willing to be the outsider. We're willing to be controversial. Why? Because in our religion, you're allowed to argue, and it's almost expected you're going to say something controversial in our religion, or else you're not doing it right. And that's what we see. Now, the difference for the next generation is that there's not going to be a Jewish center in terms of in the front and center, because the next generation of great iconic music stars are going to be people who don't write their own music. People in the 50s, like Elvis, who obviously is the most famous rock star of the 50s, maybe of all time. You have this transition to people who are playing music, but using other people's written music. So Elvis is not Jewish, but who's writing songs for him? A lot of Jews. A lot of the music in the 50s and early 60s were written by Jews for people like Elvis Presley. And so even though he and most of the early great rock and roll stars were not Jewish, obviously the Beatles are not Jewish. However, the Beatles manager, the guy who found him and said, let's make you big, was Jewish. So we see all of these new stars coming out, and there's some Jews, it's not a big deal, but there just aren't, until the next decade where that is all going to change. It's all going to change in the 60s. And sorry,
Big bottle of water.
well, but yeah, gotta stay hydrated for you guys.
How many of those do you drink a day?
I don't drink enough. Yeah, I mean, it's hard because, you know, it's hard to drink a lot of water when your stomach's filled with so much vodka. You know, it's just really hard. Stuart.
I think there's a shift going on that's perhaps a little different from what you had, because in fact, Gershwin, except for his classical pieces, rarely performed his own music. Certainly, none of his popular music was performed by George or Ira Gershwin. Uh, what's his name? Berlin didn't perform. The only
Yeah.
time they performed was when they were recognized for the writing. I think the shift is not so much as you described it, but perhaps more the emphasis being the identification of the composer or author of the music. And that stopped in the 50s and 60s.
That's a
I
good
think
point.
that's very much where that
Irving
kind of
Berlin
thing
wrote
went
that,
on.
wasn't
So I
it?
think it's a different kind of a cultural shift.
Uh,
The second observation I would make
Yeah.
is that throughout this whole period, from Berlin all the way through rock and roll, the big influence, the genesis of all of that was neither Jews nor white musicians. It was the black musicians. Alexander's Ragtime Band is absolutely a great piece of ragtime, but it really is a descendant of Scott Joplin and W.C. Handy. It didn't originate.
And also with Elvis, I mean, that's where he got his.
I think a lot of it comes from two other places, going really back. One is the church largely prohibiting music that was not liturgical music. Therefore, music ended up, in a sense, being left to the Jews. When the Hasidim started using music, and even that was controversial among the Jews, there were really, even still at that time, not that many musicians writing serious music that was not church music. I think the second thing goes to probably the 20th century, the 1900s, and that's the development of what was the so-called Botkin, who was an entertainer, a Jewish entertainer who entertained at Jewish weddings because music had become, in a lot of communities, musical instruments had become prohibited. And certainly if the ceremony was going to be on Shabbos or impinge on Shabbos, you couldn't have music. So the Botkin was essentially started as an insult comic, really, and brought forth this whole ideas. So I think
Larry.
I think perhaps we're just starting too late.
Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. One, just going back to Alexander's Ragtime Band. I think the importance of Alexander's Ragtime Band was that it legitimized jazz. That for the first time, it took jazz out of the so-called Black community and brought it into a worldwide audience, and it so-called legitimized it, and it created a whole new genre from which many, many other composers, including Irving Berlin and Gershwin and Jerome Kern and others, took off. So it basically took it out. And there's a marvelous scene in the Al Jolson story where he basically is a minstrel character, and he's late for a minstrel show. Why? Because he's in one of the basements and he's listening to some of this jazz music. Even though he's been performing in blackface, that's black music. Now all of a sudden he's listening to the jazz music. And I think that kind of shows that the Jewish performers, as well as many of the other performers, were now ready to embrace that kind of thing and take it out of the basements. It's almost like rap music, now being sort of legitimized. So I think that's why it's important. I wanted to make the other comment about the jazz singer and kind of the irony, and maybe we've discussed this before, that being the first talkie singing kind of movie. There were other talkies before that were, very short films. This was the first full-length feature film. But basically what it shows is the way a person is assimilated, because he is almost giving up his Judaism. At the end, he does go back and he sings Kol Nidra in the synagogue, as his father is dying. But it basically shows how Jews are willing to assimilate and how Jewish values. And I think that's really what Irving Berlin and particularly Irving Berlin with songs like White Christmas and Easter Parade, were really trying to get at, is that these were more national holidays. And I think Rabbi and I discussed this briefly, is that a lot of the Irving Berlin songs, even though they're around holidays, The songs, the Easter Parade and the White Christmas in particular, have no mention of Christ. They have no mention of religion in it. They're kind of like, another Jewish songwriter, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, or Chestnuts by the Open, the Mel Torme song. They're Jewish songwriters who are writing about America. And I think, if anything, Irving Berlin, of course, with God Bless America and those songs, he really embraced America and America values, and he was thankful to be here, and he thought himself as Christmas is more of an American holiday, and he didn't think of it as a national, as a religious holiday.
Good point. And Ron.
Yes. Just talking about Irving Berlin and, of course, anti-Semitism. When Irving Berlin wrote God Bless America, which was made famous by Kate Smith, Franklin Delano Roosevelt called Irving Berlin into the White House, and he asked Irving Berlin if it would be all right if they changed the national anthem from the Star Spangled Banner to God Bless America. And he refused because he didn't want anti-Semitism to flare up, being that God Bless America was written by a Jew.
I did not know that story. That's really interesting.
And just one other thing about the Gershwins. The Gershwins wrote Rhapsody in Blue. They actually wrote it in one of Arlene's grandparents' speakeasies, because all their speakeasies had the pianos. And that's where they started writing
Wow.
Rhapsody in Blue.
You don't happen to have that piano still somewhere?
No.
No, but
That would probably worth a little bit of money there.
her grandmother was well connected, and the places that they owned, a lot of was run by Sadie. Sadie was her grandmother.
Which is now a popular name for kids today. So those are all excellent points, and I think they're all right. I mean, there's not one way to look at all this. Certainly the African-American world was many ways the most influential, and there was no way they could bring that music to the masses because they couldn't be the face doing it. I mean, again, you always had exceptions. Louis Armstrong, obviously, maybe the most important musician overall of the 20th century, but the population would not accept a mass of them until today, until more recent times. The Jews, when you look at them on TV and you go to a concert, they look they look just like regular white people. So it made it a lot easier to transmit this music. Plus, when you had, of course, Prohibition, that just made everything more fun, which was helped the Roaring Twenties quite a bit to be roaring. So all of that, I mean, it's all right. I mean, there's all of this combined. The 20th century was a very unique musical century, as the masses really dictated the music, much more than the elite, I think, because people started realizing they could make money from music, making it for the masses through, of course, records, radio, movies, Broadway. There were just all these options, and they were not relegated. You think of people like Mozart or Beethoven, they were restricted to music by whoever was paid. They could only make music when they had somebody who was very rich paying them and hiring them to be their in-house musician for a couple of years. That's how they made music. That's how they made money. Whereas these musicians, Irving Berlin, Gershwin, and they could make money from the masses. I'm making $1 from 100 people instead of $100 from one person. And that changed. And of course, modern technology had a lot to do with it, with the radio and records. So it's really an interesting transformation. But, some of them still, like Gustav Mahler, he didn't write very much because he was also a conductor. He had to make a living as a conductor. And so he didn't write as much as others who were an in-house person. So now we see this now, the next transition, and we'll finish with this and we can go into more detail later, is the 60s. Again, I'm a big Beatles fan. So obviously it started with the Beatles and with the movement in America, the 60s movement, which we think about as obviously the 60s and the whole Flower Child. But what it really did was change the way music was written. Because in the 50s, all the rock stars, or most of them, got their music from writers. People were writing, and then the record company, you would pick your shit, and then you sing it. In the 60s, musicians like Simon and Garfunkel and all these other Jews started writing their own music. And the Beatles were one of the first ones to do this, or really the Beatles obviously changed everything. And of course, the most famous of all, when you go to Rolling Stones, the most important rock writer of all time who wrote music, who wrote rock songs, obviously is going to be
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan. I mean, that's no question. He's number one.
Yeah.
He's written so many songs. He changed the way that he won the Nobel Prize for literature.
Yeah.
I mean, that is, he is the guy, and obviously Jewish, not Jewish, depending on which day you talk to him. But
He sold the rights to all of his songs this week.
I know, that's what also, and we don't know how much he sold it for, but they think it's
300 million.
Exactly. What does that mean? Does that mean that somebody else can get all the money from his songs?
Yeah, that nickel a song that you get is now going to someone else, to a corporation.
They say, I forgot who sold theirs for 100 million, and so they think his is going to be way more than that. So who knows how much? I know when Michael Jackson had the Beatles one, I think his I don't know if they still own it. So Bob Dylan, of course, grew up listening to Elvis Presley, and his favorite song was Hound Dog. And Hound Dog was, of course, written by a nice Jewish boy, or actually two Jewish boys. So this is his influence. The 60s empowered. Unfortunately, there's always a side effect. Everything positive has a negative side effect. All of the musicians started writing their own songs, which is great. It's empowering. But what does that mean? It means a lot of the songwriters are out of jobs. So all these great songwriters from the 50s and early 60s all of a sudden don't have anybody to write for, because all musicians write their own songs. So, I mean, again, people were still using other people's songs, but not 100%. So what we see is the influence of Jews in American music has been very, very impressive. Not the complete dominance of comedy or of movies, but really quite impressive, again, because America is a much more open society. One reason, another reason because of our education background, another reason is because we're willing to be controversial and argue. And other reasons, this culture of this counterculture that became so popular in the 20th century, being an outsider, things like prohibition added to it, things like connection to the African American world, which was a huge influence, as we know. Ideas like the technology of the records and radio, that obviously maybe even the most important influence, because of radio, because of records, people in middle America could listen to the same thing that people were listening to in New York City. All of a sudden, the farmer in Nebraska's daughter and son are listening to Alexander's Ragtime Band because they've got a record player, or because later they've got a radio, or they're going to the dance at the big barn, then they have a band playing that other music. And it became a national trend, whereas before this type of thing had usually been within the elite and in certain areas with the lower classes because of proximity. So it really is incredible, the technology, what it did for music of the 20th century. It really created these icons. And when you add Broadway into it and you add TV and radio, I mean, just really boomed. And that's what we're seeing even today. Today, of course, it's really changed because it's all on the internet. And I don't, that's a whole new way. I always wonder if, a 20-year-old musician today who releases a record, does he even know what a record is? Because they still say we're releasing the record, even though there's no actual record, it's going online, so.
Vinyl's making a comeback.
Yeah, I guess it is. So any thoughts before we go and decide what we're going to do from now in the next couple of weeks? We decided, but we had some really great ideas come up afterwards. Stuart, do you have anything you wanted to add?
I just was wondering because somehow I got the idea that we were going to talk about Bernstein today.
Oh, no, I think we're setting that for later, right? I think that's going to be.
What I had suggested was that maybe we talk about, and I'm going to get Jeff Glazer involved in it maybe next week if he's available, but he
That's why
wasn't
I didn't mention
available.
Bernstein at all, because he's just going to talk about it whenever we set that up.
Right, but we had a couple of thoughts, and that's why I sent out a couple of different ideas. Like there are other Jewish composers that have written songs, liturgical music or music for the synagogue as well as for the church. And Bernstein wrote something called Mass, which was dedicated actually at the Washington, whatever, Lincoln Center, kind of Washington place, whatever it's called.
It's Kennedy Center.
That's Kennedy Center.
But he also has written other music, for the synagogue. He's written Symphony No. 1 and Symphony No. 3. Symphony No. 1 is the Jeremiah Symphony, and Symphony No. 3 is Kaddish. And he's written the Yigdal, and he's written many, many other things, that have many Jewish influences, as well as West Side Story and something called the Chichester Psalms, which is based on psalms that he wrote for a chorale of 3 cathedrals in England. And he used 6 different psalms in that, and he uses little excerpts or parts of it from parts of West Side Story that he never used before. So we could talk about that next week, possibly when Jeff Glazer comes on. But the one thing I did want to talk about was maybe a couple of other things as far as thoughts is, if you wanted to in a future week, maybe next week we can divert to Leonard Bernstein.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the thing was next week, talking about Leonard Bernstein.
Right.
And, or Bernstein, depending on who you're talking to. And we'll have Jeff, we'll speak a little bit about Mass and about Elijah and Kaddish. If that's okay with everybody else, I thought it would be a really great idea.
The Bernstein's Mass was written for the Kennedy Center, and Jackie Kennedy wanted him to write it.
And, it was written in honor of Jack Kennedy.
Yeah.
That's the dedication of that piece.
And once they had the opening of the JFK Center, they destroyed the what do they call it?
The recording?
No, the what they make the what
Master?
when they print something, what do they call it that they print from? A
videotape?
No. The sheets that you print. I think that's what it is. The
plate?
plate.
Oh,
the
plates.
plates. They destroyed the plates because everyone that went to the opening got a
limited edition program we got.
What do they
I
call
don't
it?
know.
It's a program.
I did.
I can't.
Oh,
think
a
of it.
program.
Oh, yes.
And my uncle was the art director for the Kennedy Center, as well as the Lincoln Center. And we have the original program
Oh, wow.
from the opening of the Kennedy Center.
That is awesome.
And in there is my uncle's name.
Not only that, but Arlene's grandmother was there as well. She was,
Yeah. You can
she
see
was
that
getting, she provided the booze for it.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
One other thought that had occurred to me is that how about Hanukkah songs?
That's a good idea too.
What I thought, maybe if we wanted to delay Bernstein for the week after or 2 weeks after, maybe what we could do is have each person bring in a Hanukkah song, maybe, and there's so many on YouTube. I had picked out a few that I thought if time permitted, I'd show them today, but they don't. But and some of them are really spoofs, and some of them are more serious songs. The Peter, Paul, and Mary Light One Candle, which was originally not even a Hanukkah song. It was a protest song, actually, for the Lebanon War. If you look back into it.
No, I did not know that.
Yeah, and they changed some of the lyrics, and then they changed them again when they performed it in Israel and things. And but there are other songs like that. If you go on YouTube, you can find quite a few of the Hanukkah songs. Many of them are the children's songs. Spin the Temple and things like that.
Maccabees.
That's a good idea.
But there are some serious ones, and I thought if maybe we did something to what we did a couple of weeks ago, where each person brought in a Jewish writer. Remember that one? And they gave a little bit of a spiel. Maybe if each one wanted to bring in a Hanukkah.
That sounds like fun.
There are 11 of us here. There aren't 11 real Hanukkah songs.
Oh, there are. There are many.
I have a little dreidel.
There are many. There are many. As a matter of fact, I have 10 of them written down right here. So
That's what I said. There aren't 11.
I have 10. There are many more than 10. Yeah.
10 minutes of Adam Sandler.
Hanukkah. There's a great many of them with a good deal of background. It's just quite a few.
Rabbi, if we're going to do Hanukkah songs, I suggest we eat latkes as we're watching.
That's a good idea.
I suggest you cook them for us.
That's even better.
Adam Sandler has 3 Hanukkah songs in himself, and there's the recent one on Saturday Night Live, which is very funny. And Jeff, of course, can talk about Tom Lehrer. He's an expert on Tom Lehrer, and Tom Lehrer has a hilarious Hanukkah song called something Hanukkah in Santa Monica, which is very, very funny if you remember who Tom Lehrer was. But Jeff can give a whole speech on that as well.
Well, do we want Jeff to come on next week, or do you want him to come the week after and do Hanukkah songs next week?
On both. Maybe we could, if you want to do Hanukkah next week, if people want to, prepare something, and then Jeff can, maybe the week after we could do Leonard Bernstein. But I just thought Hanukkah was more topical right now, if we wanted to.
Larry, send us some of your songs if you can.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll send you the names. You could research them. A couple of them have wound up in what they call these flash mob things, which in Israel you could see people doing these flash mobs. Where spontaneously, so to speak, spontaneously rehearsed. They break into songs and television markets, and they do these flash mobs, and they have a couple of Hanukkah ones there that are really well done. So I think it would be very entertaining to see that. But I'll send out a list to everybody, and you can pick one and on YouTube, and maybe we can try to show some of those, and maybe even have a favorite from your childhood or something. And then maybe I'll ask Jeff Jeff Glazer to do it the week after. But he can incorporate next week maybe some of the Tom Lehrer stuff. The Hanukkah in Santa Monica and the Adam Sandler stuff, which is very funny, I think.
Yeah, I think that's great. All right, so we'll do that next week. We're going to do Hanukkah music.
Okay.
All right. Just typing that down so I don't forget.
Rabbi,
Right. Yes, Flossie.
are there different customs of celebrating Hanukkah around the world that we could throw a little of that in?
Yeah, we could throw that in. There are a lot of different customs. Obviously, it's a minor holiday, but there are some different ones as to what you eat.
Not in this country.
Well, I know in Israel, sufganiot, but I didn't know if there were other than food.
Oh, yeah. And again, you'll find the same thing everywhere.
One of the other things I had mentioned on the list
I'll do that.
I sent out was something that kind of stirred my curiosity from something you had said at last week's Shabbat service, where you said you celebrate holidays. It gives you an opportunity, since we're such blended families now. We celebrate holidays. And I thought maybe, since many of us are part of blended families, maybe we could talk a little about that. How do we celebrate the holiday season? In much the same way, let's say that Irving Berlin wrote White Christmas. You can kind of, celebrate Christmas without celebrating the religious aspects of Christmas. And I didn't know whether that would be an appropriate.
We can add that in there too. And obviously that is a very, as I
very personal,
sermon, my mother-in-law, my wife's family are all Christian, all Catholic. So it's been very interesting. I think this is a great idea. So we can do a little bit of combination of doing a little bit of the Hanukkah songs. We can commiserate on how there's so many more Christmas songs written by really top-notch Jewish writers, as opposed to any of them having the audacity to even write one decent Hanukkah song, because almost all the good ones are from recent times.
Well, Rabbi, isn't Kol Nidre written by a Christian?
Oh, the music for Kol Nidre? Oh, the
Yeah.
music.
No,
Is it? That would be great. I had no idea.
I would doubt it. I would
Okay,
doubt it.
by Brooke.
there's one, I just heard that the other day. There's one very
Maybe there's a version.
in Kol Nidre written by a Christian. I'll have to
Well,
check it out.
Well, is it, somebody, what are they, the conversos? Was it somebody who? was
No.
forced to convert? No.
It was written by Brooke, by Anton Brooke.
But maybe there are other.
The major, or he's the one who incorporated it mostly into.
Well, there are a bunch. I mean, there's a lot of different. There's not ways to sing Kol Nidre. We're just all used to the same one because it's become so popular and around America. But there are different versions, obviously, throughout history.
That was another thing you had mentioned about, I guess we never discussed the Kol Nidre prayer.
Right. We talked about doing Jewish liturgical music next week, but we can do that in a couple of weeks. I think doing stuff for Hanukkah is much more apropos and timely. I think you're right.
Because I think if people saw the Duty Fisher song, going where he does Kol Nidre, and then.
Oh yeah, and I think we can do. I think we have plenty of time to do that.
Okay.
And, yeah, Hanukkah's. We have one Wednesday in Hanukkah this year, so might as well do that.
Okay. So we'll do Hanukkah next week.
Yeah.
And I'll send out a list and people can choose a particular song, maybe go on YouTube and at least get the, and do you have the opportunity then to, Rabbi, if people saw a song, they can, you can.
Yeah, they can just, in the moment, I can look it up on YouTube and play it. I can make those people, if you know how to do it, make you a co-host and you can play it yourself.
That's what I was looking for. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, because we have, and they also have all the fun stuff like the Maccabees and 613, where they're the parody songs that have become so popular and so well done. It's great because if you have technological skills, you can make great videos and make music sound really good and almost as good as the professionals. And so inevitably you become professional.
All right, now I'll ask Jeff Glazer to maybe we'll do Bernstein in a couple of weeks then.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
All right, guys. And is it Bernstein or Bernstein? I hear both all the time. It's one of those things, and you never know which one.
Yes,
is it Bernstein or Bernstein? Who knows?
Yes, it is. Yes.
So are we each choosing a Hanukkah song for next week?
Yeah, choose a Hanukkah song.
And do we have to let you know so that we don't have repeats?
I was going to say, if anybody has one, they already just email me what you're doing, and I'll tell you if somebody else has got it. So it's who first come, first serve. So if anybody wants to claim anything, let me know.
I'll send out a list also, so in case.
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
Look at a couple of different ones that I have on my list. Okay, great.
Okay, and I'm not taking I Have a Little Dreidel. I'll let somebody else take that one.
That's the only one I know.
And the classics. Well, really, it was written by Irving Berlin, taking off the lyrics though are from Shakespeare. And I know Mozart had a little bit of hand in there as well. So it's Shakespeare, Mozart, Berlin. So that's why it's such a great song.
One other little bit of trivia. I didn't want to mention this before, but sometimes you find these great collaborations in both musical theater, like Rodgers and Hammerstein and Rodgers and Hart, and you also find it in opera. And in opera, you talk about Mozart and his great collaborator for three of his most famous operas, Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte, was a fellow named Lorenzo da Ponte, and Lorenzo da Ponte was Jewish.
Did he stay Jewish or did he convert?
He stayed Jewish. As a matter of fact, after Mozart died at a very young age, much like George Gershwin did. Da Ponte came to America, and he was at the New Columbia University. He became a professor there of some sort of maybe the Italian language or Romance languages or something, and he lived in New Jersey while professor at Columbia. So New Jersey got into the act again.
All right.
But the
New Jersey is always there.
So there were some Jewish people that were in classical music at the time.
But Larry, did you know that Tom Lehrer once said that he's accomplished little in his life, and that when he thinks of Mozart, by the time Mozart was his age, he'd already been dead for 4 years.
Yeah, well, maybe we can even get Jeff. It's nothing to do with Hanukkah, but maybe he can even do the elements for us, Tom Lehrer's elements. If you haven't heard that, He
I
does.
have not.
It's absolutely sensational that he recites every one of the elements, or at least 92 of them. I guess up to uranium or something. I don't know if you had plutonium and carbon, californium and all the new ones, but yeah, that Tom Lehrer had. It's a great song.
He was such a brilliant guy so. All right.
It was
Thank you.
wonderful seeing everybody.
Great to see you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we
Be
finish,
well, be
well.
safe.
one more thing. We have all our Hanukkah programs coming up. So Friday night, we're going to have 6 o'clock. We're just going to do a Hanukkah lighting because we're inviting all the kids. So we're going to do it on Zoom. Just light the second night candle, light Shabbat candles. And then Kelly is going to lead us in a couple of those Hanukkah songs. Saturday, right after services, we have a speaker from Israel who's going to talk about the archaeology and history of the Maccabees.
Oh.
And so that's going to be live from Israel. You can come onto Zoom or you can go onto YouTube. If you want to participate, go onto Zoom. His name's Yoram Preminger, who's also a tour guide there, and he was a tour guide for us. He has a great presentation. And then next, I know it may not, but next Thursday, we're doing our first synagogue in-person events. That's not a car event. We're going to light the menorah. You can stand as far back in the park. We're going to do it outside, and we'll have sufganiyot for anybody.
And Sunday, Chabad is having a parade of cars going from the Tanger Center to somewhere near Coligny. I don't remember where. And they are going to have a major Hanukkah lighting also.
I know they're doing one downtown here, and the park. I don't know if how many people are going live or they're going to do it.
So that's a different.
It's a different thing. But one of our students,
different center.
Yeah, one of our students won the Hanukkah contest, and 2 of the 3 judges were from our congregation. So I don't think there's a connection there. But
I have this thing, and you can think about it or decide that I'm crazy, but
too late.
I have this visceral objection to lighting Hanukkahs in public, and because I really believe in the separation of church and state, and we as Jews sometimes object to having a manger on a town hall square, and I don't object to Christmas trees. Nobody says a bracha, but a Hanukkah is just objectively a religious object, and we say a prayer before we light it, and to me that makes it inappropriate to use as a public symbol of Hanukkah. Use a dreidel. I'll send you a
copy of the Supreme Court case on public display of Hanukkahs.
Yeah, and again, it's
that did reach the Supreme Court.
Yeah, but even so, I mean, that's their opinion, and this isn't a legal thing. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I respectfully disagree with you, but okay.
Okay, that's fine.
That's why we're Jews. You don't respectfully disagree at all. You just disagree. It's just respect is assumed.
No. I respect his opinion. I respect his stand.
Respect is assumed. There's so many ways to look at that. We are not doing the one for the city of Savannah. We don't participate in, but it's kind of been a Chabad thing for years. I think they started in 1974, and it's just took off.
Yeah,
like this. Listen, the Orthodox light the menorah in Washington D.C. They got thousands and thousands of people there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hopefully not this year. Hopefully not this year.
And I never attended when I
actually, you're supposed to display it in your window.
You are supposed to display it.
It's meant to be publicly displayed. So from the Jewish standpoint, it's really an obligation.
Publicly displayed but publicly displayed in your window, which is your window, which is different from publicly displayed on the street. You don't light your Hanukkah and put it on your doorstep. Well, I don't want to waste people's time.
We're going to go next week. Part of it, we're going to talk about this will be one of the discussions next week.
Why would I permit an angel on the top of the tree then? Or a star of Bethlehem?
All right. with that,
Okay, bye, everybody.
Okay.
Okay, have a good week.
we could do continues. We're over time, so we can keep talking about it. But again, you guys have a wonderful, wonderful Hanukkah, whether you're going to a overtly lit in public lighting, lit and lighten, or whether you're doing online, but hopefully we'll see you for one of the Hanukkah things here, and look forward to seeing you at the very least next Wednesday.
Good to see everybody
You
smiling.
look good. You look good.
Happy birthday, Jane.
Jane, your birthday. Happy birthday.
Happy
Happy
birthday, Jane.
birthday.
Michael, since it happens at Christmas time, is it a lit mass fest?
Oh.
Hey, Jeff.
What a way to end. What a way to end.
Bye, everybody.
Hi, guys.
Bye.